want to thank everyone for joining us today. Very excited about my guest for Author Talk today, Leslie Kaminoff. Leslie is a yoga educator who is internationally recognized. If you're in the yoga world, you've probably heard of him for sure. He has experience spanning 4 decades. So I'm very interested in hearing some of his perspective today. Just a quick few notes. He is the founder of eSutra. He's created content and courses to help other yoga teachers kind of be their best. And today he is here to talk again about, like I said, all things yoga and yoga anatomy. This is the 3rd edition. So again, yeah, there you go. Glad you have your copy there too.
I have the first 2 editions also, so yeah.
And that's something that we're definitely going to get into. First, I gave a kind of a brief introduction, but for the listeners, if you could kind of give us some of your background, you know, kind of give everyone an idea of how you got into yoga and breathing, and just kind of your journey on how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Well, I think we counted the decades wrong. 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, teens, 20s. That's like 6 decades.
Okay. so a little bit longer than what I said.
Yeah, well, I took my teacher training in 79, so I can barely count the 70s, but it's been a minute. It's been a minute. Right. But I actually took my first yoga class in 1978 when I was 20 years old at the invitation of my father, who was studying yoga here in New York. And that was with a group called the Shivananda Organization. It's a worldwide group that has probably trained more teachers at this point than any other group in history. And I just got steadily more and more involved, and it became sort of my full-time gig right from the beginning. At first I was working for that organization, which is sort of an ashram-based traditional, you know, very Hindu kind of organization. But then I got transferred out to Los Angeles in the early 80s. And when I left the Shivananda organization, I almost immediately got involved in sports medicine. And so, you know, that immediately sort of put me on track to, I think, eventually hook up with human kinetics. Because that began my exposure to things like anatomy, kinesiology, postural analysis, you know, gait retraining. And it was that particular time in history in LA was very focused on all this because, of course, we had the Olympics coming in '84.
Sure.
And the place I was working, the International Sports Medicine Institute, was working with a lot of the athletes who would eventually be on that team. So I was just thrown right into that world at a pretty young age. And the kind of learner I am is that I'm more of the observe and absorb kind of learner.
Sure.
I've never been very academically oriented. But if you put me in a situation like that, I'm like a sponge. And that's where the combination of the yoga and the anatomy really sort of started really becoming very important for me.
Okay, very good. Like you held up the other editions of this book. The original release of Yoga Anatomy, I believe, was over 15 years ago.
2007.
2007.
Yeah.
Right. And so now, like we pointed out, we have the 3rd edition now. I think anyone who is a teacher, a coach, and trainer, you're going to evolve over time, and your knowledge base is going to evolve over time. So things can change, perspectives can change. So I'm curious how yoga anatomy and your perspective has changed over these years for these numbers of editions.
Well, yeah, and it became, well, the way it tracked for us, for Amy and I, because we're co-authors on this, she truly was the co-author as far back as the 1st edition.
Okay.
Although she came onto the project a little bit late, we couldn't get her name on the front cover. So the best we could do was list her as Asana Analysis by Amy Matthews. But the 2nd edition was really all the stuff that we had wanted to put in the 1st edition.
Okay.
But because of the number of deadlines that we went through, and the pressure to really get it out on the absolute drop dead deadline, which we barely did. We started pulling stuff out and just getting it down to the bare minimum of what we felt we could confidently say about the poses and in the front matter. The second edition was really about putting everything back in that we wish we had been able to put in the first edition. And the reason it took so long to get the first edition out is that there was no existing method of analysis for postures that anyone had ever done before. And so we had to come up with that on the fly. And the problem was that during that process of figuring out how to analyze the poses, we had to already have been working on the illustrations because they took a really long time. So a lot of back and forth between us and the artist because she had no knowledge of yoga. And so it was a very steep learning curve for her. Not to mention technical difficulties, you know, the method that she used, and I thought this would be interesting. I prepared this for you. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, if we go to this, like this pose here, this seated twist pose.
Okay, sure.
So this will let people know a little bit about what the process was like. And this is just one illustration. So it starts as a photo, right?
Okay.
And this is my partner, Lydia Mann, who did the cover design and a lot of the information design and all photography, did all the photos for the book. So we send the illustrator this photo. What she does then is she takes her skeleton in her studio and puts it in that shape.
Okay.
And then draws by hand in pencil.
Oh, wow.
There's no computers at this point, right?
That is impressive.
Yeah, so she draws that into the outline of the photo. Now we get this and we look at it and we go, oh, no. There's lots of corrections.
Right.
The scapula are facing the wrong way. The femur is not where the sitting bones aren't lined up. And the problem was that, you know, human beings are all different proportions in their skeletal structure. She only had one skeleton to pose.
Sure.
So she's drawing this one skeleton all the time with its proportions into the photographs of our models that have all of their unique proportions.
Right.
So we're having to make all of those adjustments in the corrections, in the rounds of corrections that we're sending back to her. Okay. So we send her back this with all the correction, and this is before this was very easily done digitally, you know.
Right.
And so it went from let's say this drawing that she sent us to this drawing after the corrections, and this is the one that ended up in the book. Now, imagine going through that with every single illustration. So it took a while, and we had not yet even come up with what we wanted to say about the poses, so we had to sort of guess what we wanted to show in the illustration based on an analysis method we had not yet figured out. So it was very, very tricky. So the second edition was about putting all the things back in that we had to pull out for time constraints. Now, the third edition, the second edition came out in 2011. So that's like, you know, 4 years after the first edition. 10 years goes by. And so we're in lockdown.
Right.
We have a deadline looming, and we're going through what we said 10 years ago. And Amy and I are like, oh, we would never say this way now, because our perspective evolves. You know, we would not use language like, you know, the spine. When the spine does this, that will happen. Because whose spine are we talking about? There is no the spine. There's only spines that people have. And so we changed all of our language to be much more personal and much more, embodied in terms of the person actually reading and holding the book in their hands. Okay. So we say your spine, you know, or things like that. So there's a lot of global changes in the language we were using. And also my perspective on breathing, which was my contribution, my main contribution to the analysis section, had evolved tremendously in the course of 10 years. So a lot of that language was redone for every single pose. And then we added 2 entirely new chapters that we co-wrote at the beginning of the book and then expanded on the existing chapters. So it was a lot of work to do. And you would think that the lockdown would have been the ideal time to sit and do nothing else but write a book. But I was dealing with like a long COVID brain fog at the time. So
Okay.
it was not particularly fun, but we didn't blow the deadline. That was the main thing.
Right. Well, I would say even given that, I mean, you guys did a great job of, getting that last edition out. And that is something that for people that haven't seen this edition or don't have their copy yet, that is really something that stands out. I know the subtitle is Your Illustrated Guide to Postures, Movements, and Breathing Techniques. And that is, we can see the difference there. Yep.
If you hold the first edition and third edition in both hands, this one weighs twice as much.
Right. Right. With so much more information, and kind of one of the points that I was going to make is, and we can kind of see here, I mean, just the detail that has gone into this, so that you can see exactly what the poses are. You can see the muscles that you are working through on that. So I know you described the process a little bit, but how important was it for you and Amy to get that correct and to be as detailed as you were?
Well, that's just Amy. I've got to give a shout out to Amy. She, the way that she and I work together, our brains are very, very different, but very compatible. Okay. Just like a left and a right hemisphere, process information differently. Okay. And so she is very, very detail oriented. You know, we would often say that, you know, if I'm the guy that sees the forest, she's the one that sees not just the tree, but, you know, like the crack in the bark and the bug in the tree. Okay. And so that's the way her mind works. And she is a certified movement analyst, very experienced in kinesiology and structure, much more knowledgeable, like in her head, able to access anatomical detail just like that. Okay. I have to look things up in my own book. Okay. Because my brain doesn't process information that way. I have more global type of processing. Mm-hmm. And so we work very well together. But yeah, it was very important to just turn Amy loose on the analysis and let her just dive into, you know, is this joint an internal or external rotation, and which muscle is doing which kind of contraction. And, you know, I played devil's advocate through the whole thing. So for me, as we were reviewing the material, I played the role of the dumb reader, which wasn't hard, actually. and I would say, well, wait a minute. And I would ask like devil's advocate questions, like, if we're describing asanas, which are, you know, statically held poses, shapes that you stay in and remain in, why aren't all the contractions isometric? Okay. Nothing's moving. Right. It's a rhetorical question, but it's a reasonable one for someone, you know, who's thinking like, wow, nothing's moving, so none of the muscles are doing anything other than an isometric contraction. And then the answer, of course, was, well, we categorize these poses by their starting position. Okay. And so you have to move from a starting position into a shape. And so what muscles had to do what to get you from the starting position to the shape? Some of them are working concentrically, some of them working eccentrically, some of them working isometrically to stabilize things. So that's the level of questioning that we had to ask for each and every pose. Once we had come up with the idea of, yes, we need to categorize these things from their starting position, sitting, standing, prone, supine, all of that, right? Kneeling. Right. Yeah. Because you could categorize them other ways. You could say, oh, here's all the forward bends, here's all the backward bends. Mm-hmm. You know? It was kind of a tricky thing. But once we had that, then just turning Amy's brain loose on it yielded all the details.
And I think that collaboration that you were speaking to worked really well with you. Like you said, you were kind of playing devil's advocate to try to figure all this out. But no, it really worked and helped lay out the book so that everyone can understand it, so that everyone can benefit from it. Now, I know you are, like you said, you are an educator. You're big on that side. So one thing that I'm sure you're proud of is that this book is great for the regular consumer. Yeah. But as I understand it, it's also become almost like a required text for a lot of yoga teachers trying to learn and trying to get into the practice.
Yeah, an absolute required text in a lot of teacher training programs. And that was the thing that really, for me, made me quite happy and proud that it was considered just a reference book or a touchstone for all the people that needed to teach the anatomy component of a teacher's training course. And that accounts, I think, for the longevity and popularity of the title and the pretty consistent sales. You know, it is an evergreen title at this point.
Right.
I don't think we'll ever get up to de Lavier's numbers, but, you know, considering that was the pitch that Human Kinetics had for me. Right. Because they approached me to write the book, not the other way around. And they said, are you familiar with strength training anatomy? And I said, yeah, I've got it on the shelf. It's right here.
There you go.
Right? He's up to the 4th edition now, I think.
Yeah.
And 2 million copies in print, right?
Right.
And I said, yeah. And they said, well, we want to do a yoga version of that kind of book. And I was like, that's not possible. Because you know, you can make a case for bicep curls being about the bicep and draw the bicep, and that's what your book is. Yoga poses aren't about this muscle or that muscle. You're using your whole body. And I told them I didn't think it was possible. And I really don't recall what made me think I should just write the proposal anyway. But when they approved the proposal, that's when I was really in deep doo-doo. And that's when I had to eventually realize I need the other half of a brain to do this. And Amy just happened to be right across the hall because she and I ran the breathing project together. So. Yeah.
So how have you seen this book, maybe specifically this 3rd edition, how have you seen the whole project kind of grow because it is a required text, and maybe just kind of being able to get that information out there?
Well, it's grown into it's grown beyond the pages of a book,
right?
Because the imagery and information and perspective, especially that we express in the book, became the gold standard of online anatomy education for teacher training programs. So we came up with, I already had some courses online, yoga anatomy courses online, and this was, I was teaching this before I did the book. And so our producing partners, Green Tea Productions, that put together my online courses, I decided to start a project that we called Fundamentals, which Amy and I co-produced with Green Tea, and that became a way to get Amy and me and the book easily integrated into a 200 or even a 500-hour yoga teacher's training course. And all of this, you know, I've had online courses going for like over 13 years now. So we were early adopters. And this was before everything started heading to the web, and certainly before the pandemic. And we did actually see an uptick in people who were enrolling in our online courses because of the pandemic and the inability to actually be, you know, in person. And in fact, it was us that helped the Yoga Alliance figure out how to handle online education, because they had no policy for it. You know? And we had people who were saying, hey, you know, how do I count these hours towards my Yoga Alliance training? And we were like, well, let's talk to the Alliance. And they were like, we're not sure. And so we actually helped set the policy that eventually industry-wide had to be sorted out, especially once COVID hit, and in-person trainings just weren't even possible. So, so the book really has influenced a whole generation, really, or maybe a couple of generations at this point of yoga educators because of the way that the material is used in the training programs.
How have you seen, just over your years of experience, how have you seen kind of yoga grow in general? Because I feel like, from my perspective, it's kind of been this niche area, but it's kind of expanded from what I've seen out to other, maybe even some like power athletes and maybe some sports that maybe you don't traditionally think of yoga or that type of work. But it really is kind of expanding.
Well, it was the athletic aspect of yoga that really contributed to its massive popularity in I would say early to mid 90s when it really exploded. And you could definitely ask that question of one of your other authors. You've heard of Yogafit?
Yep.
So talk to Beth Shaw about that.
Right.
Because she was a pioneer in getting teachers able to teach yoga in a fitness environment. Now, it was a little controversial at the time because she just had a weekend-long training, right? But she was actually jumping into a market where the demand for yoga teachers far exceeded the supply. And we're talking like early 90s now, right? And that was just the case because there was this very athletic style of vinyasa, flow. It was all sort of influenced by Ashtanga yoga, which came out of Mysore, which is actually connected with my teaching tradition. And so the gyms were going like, wow, this is amazing. You can sweat, you can get a workout, it's spiritual, you know, it's good for you. And it just hit the zeitgeist at just the right angle to merge with the relatively new fitness industry. It's important to remember in the early 90s, the fitness industry was barely 10 years old.
Right.
You know, because you can track that back to the early 80s and Jane Fonda. And the early 80s is when I was in LA doing sports medicine, watching all of that happen. So, you know, I've been present at these two inflection points, roughly 10 years apart, the early 80s, early 90s, where, you know, you had this evolving fitness culture and industry starting to merge with what became a yoga industry because of their mutual influences. And so Beth jumps into this thing. She says to the club owners, look, you know, you've already got people that know how to lead group fitness. They're called aerobics teachers. Give them to me for a weekend and you'll have yoga on the schedule on Monday, right?
Right.
And then, you know, and so that was her business model. It was brilliant. I don't fault her at all for it. It was just brilliant. But it made people like me who, you know, grew up in ashrams and things like that go, they're training teachers in a weekend, what the hell? We should probably sit down and figure out how many hours we think at a minimum it takes to train a teacher. And I actually was one of the people I was, what's the song from Hamilton? I was in the room where it happened. I was in the room when we came up with these 200 and 500 hour standards. And part of what influenced those conversations was Yogafit, the weekend training. So I've seen this track from my own personal history and from the involvement I've had professionally with some of the key influencers and the people that really helped bring all of this into the mainstream.
Something that I think that goes along with it, that I think maybe some people who aren't as familiar with yoga might think it's just a series of poses, but there's so much more to it. I know you're big on the breathing aspect. Yeah. So can you talk about that a little bit and how important that is to incorporate?
Sure. Well, according to my teacher, TKV Desikachar, if the breath is not at the core of what you're doing in your practice, then it's not yoga.
Right.
So that's how important breath was to him. And so in the simplest terms, I would say that from the yoga perspective, we view the breath as the connection between the mind and the body. So people talk about, you know, mindfulness and, you know, mindful movement or embodied movement or whatever. But what that really means on a nuts and bolts practical level in a practice is that if you can link what your body is doing physically with how the breath is moving in and out of your body, the level of focus that's required to get that to happen is a kind of a yoga, because yoga, the word itself just means to join.
Okay.
The root, the Sanskrit root, yuj, that gives us the word yoga, is the same root that gives us the word yoke, to yoke things together. So there's, in that sense, when we talk about the breath, it's the yoking together of the mind and the body through the medium of the breath. So that's just a very practical way of looking at it. On deeper levels, the consideration of how we breathe as humans brings us right immediately up to this realization that we have some voluntary control over what our breath is doing. But there's limits, there's pretty severe physiological limits on how much control we have over our breathing before the automatic behaviors kick in.
Okay.
Physiologically driven.
Yep.
To learn more about yoga physiology, consult another one of your authors.
Right.
I gave it.
Just going to tie everybody to
that was. We actually, Amy and I considered doing the physiology book at one point, and we did have these conversations with Human Kinetics, but we just never took that one on. And I'm glad that you got one out, because it really was a missing piece to the puzzle. So you hit these physiological limits on your control of breathing. And so what that does is it puts you in the conversation of what aspects of my life do I have some choice about, and which aspects of my life do I need to surrender to? And that's a big conversation. That's a spiritual conversation,
right,
as much as anything else. But it's also how our breath manifests physiologically in our body. And so we're learning these lessons from our body, from our breath, and it's not, we don't have to go to a sacred scripture or master Sanskrit or understand any of that. If you put the breath at the center of what you're doing, it's going to teach you those lessons if you frame it in the right context.
Okay. Awesome. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm definitely appreciative of your time. I know you are a very busy person, but
I have a few.
I do want to.
I don't have to run off for another half hour or so. So yeah.
No, that's okay. But I do want to make sure that everyone, if you don't have a copy, make sure that you are going to pick up your copy of Yoga Anatomy. I know it's on our website, us.humankinetics.com. It's on Amazon. It's everything. This is for the listeners. Everything that Leslie talked about today is included in some aspect in this book. I probably actually gave you a little more information here because he is so knowledgeable. But I will, like I said, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I know you have a busy day, but I want to give you the last word here to kind of wrap it up, and to maybe let everyone know where they can follow all the work that you're doing and all the work that you'll continue to do. I know you travel quite a bit too.
Yeah, well, I'm starting to travel again after not going anywhere for a while, but no one was. Yeah, people can follow up. I'm easy to reach. My main website is yogaanatomy.org. Amy can be found at embodiedasana.com or embodied yoga, or just look for Amy Matthews on the web. She has a bunch of material there. I travel, so you can go to my website and check my calendar. And if we're in the same geographic vicinity, I'd love to have people drop by and say hi and do some yoga